"Be strong," her mother whispered, then her heart stopped. The machines flatlined. She screamed for help, shaking her mother's body. "Mom, please, wake up. Please don't leave me." But no one came. The only person who'd ever loved her was gone. She collapsed beside the bed, sobbing, clutching her mother's cold hand. That's when the door opened. Her husband walked in, not alone. His mother stood behind him, arms crossed. His mistress followed, smiling. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't look at her mother's body. He threw divorce papers onto the deathbed and screamed, "Sign this now. I'm done with you." Her mother's body was still warm. The mother-in-law leaned closer, her voice like ice. "Sign it and leave my son. You were never good enough." The mistress smiled wider. Her husband's voice cut through her sobs. "Sign it, you worthless thing. Take that baby and get out of my life." She looked at the papers, then at her mother's face. And she remembered something her mother had whispered years ago. Something no one else knew. Something that would destroy them all. Before we dive into this story, I need your help. YouTube only shows this to more people if you subscribe and comment. So hit that subscribe button right now, then drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. Texas at midnight? Canada with morning coffee? Let me know you're here. We're a community, and your voice matters. Now, let's jump into the story. Clara sat frozen in the plastic chair beside her mother's hospital bed, her fingers wrapped around Eleanor's frail hand like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. The room was suffocating. Sterile white walls, flickering fluorescent lights, and the relentless beeping of machines that measured life in numbers Clara didn't want to understand. Her mother's breathing was shallow, uneven, each breath a battle she was losing. Clara had been here for hours, watching the woman who raised her slip away inch by inch, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. "Mom, I'm here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm not leaving. I promise." Eleanor's eyelids fluttered open, just barely, and her lips moved in a weak attempt to speak. Clara leaned closer, her heart pounding. "What is it, Mom? What do you need?" Eleanor's voice came out in a rasp. So faint Clara had to hold her breath to hear it. "I'm sorry, Clara. I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you." Tears burned Clara's eyes, blurring her vision. "Don't say that. You protected me my whole life. You gave me everything." Eleanor's grip tightened, just slightly, her fingers cold and trembling. "Be strong. Even when I'm gone. Promise me you'll be strong." Clara nodded, her throat closing up, her chest heaving with sobs she couldn't hold back. "I promise, Mom. I'll be strong. I'll survive. I swear." For 3 years, Clara had begged Nathaniel to let her mother move in with them. 3 years of pleading, of explaining that Eleanor's health was failing, that she couldn't afford proper care, that she needed a family. Every single time, Nathaniel had looked at her with that calm, detached expression he always wore when he wanted to end a conversation without raising his voice. "We don't have the space, Clara," he'd say, his tone so reasonable it made her feel insane for even asking. And then Vivian, his mother, would step in with that tight, disapproving smile and deliver the final blow. "We are not a charity, Clara. Your mother made her choices. She'll have to live with them." Nathaniel never argued. He never defended Clara. He just nodded, stood up, and walked away, leaving her standing there with the weight of her mother's suffering pressing down on her chest. So Clara had done the only thing she could. She visited in secret. She paid the hospital bills with money she scraped together from skipping meals, from selling the jewelry her mother had given her years ago, from hiding cash in places Nathaniel would never think to look. Every receipt was a sin she buried. Every visit was a crime she committed in silence. And Nathaniel never asked. Vivian never questioned. They didn't care where Clara went or why she came home looking like she'd been crying. They were content to let Eleanor rot in a public hospital, alone and forgotten, because acknowledging her existence would have been inconvenient. Now on this freezing February night, with snow falling outside the window and the machines slowing their rhythm, Eleanor was dying, and Clara was the only one holding her hand. Her mother's breathing hitched, stuttered, and then stopped. The monitor flatlined with a single, piercing tone that cut through the room like a scream. Clara's body went numb. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what had just happened. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, no, no, please, Mom, please don't leave me." But Eleanor's hand went limp in hers, and the warmth drained from her skin, and Clara knew it was over. She pressed her forehead against her mother's hand and sobbed, her whole body shaking, her heart ripping apart in her chest. She had nothing left. No family, no support. No one cared if she lived or died. And then the door opened. Clara looked up, her vision blurred with tears, expecting a nurse to tell her it was time to go. But it wasn't a nurse. It was Nathaniel. He stood in the doorway, tall and composed, holding a folder in his hands. Behind him, Vivian entered with her arms crossed, her face tight with irritation, like she'd been inconvenienced by having to come here at all. And behind her, stepping into the room with slow, deliberate confidence, was Vanessa, the mistress. The woman Nathaniel had been sleeping with for over a year. The woman Clara had pretended not to know about because confronting it would have shattered the last fragile piece of dignity she had left. Clara's breath caught in her throat. "What are you doing here?" Her voice came out broken, barely audible. Nathaniel didn't answer. He walked to the bed, his shoes clicking against the tile floor, and placed the folder down. Not on the table, not on the chair, on the bed, right next to Eleanor's lifeless arm. Clara stared at it, her mind struggling to understand. "What is that?" Nathaniel looked at her, and for the first time in their marriage, she saw something other than indifference in his eyes. She saw relief. Divorce papers. The words hit Clara like a physical blow. Her stomach dropped. Her ears rang. She couldn't breathe. "You're divorcing me? Right now?" "My mother just died, Nathaniel. She just died." He didn't flinch. "I'm done pretending, Clara. I've been patient with you. I've tolerated your constant need for validation, your tears, your weakness. But you embarrassed me at the last dinner party. You made me look like a fool in front of my colleagues. I can't keep doing this." Clara's hand shook. Her chest heaved. "I didn't do anything. I was quiet the entire night. I barely said a word." Vivian stepped forward, her voice sharp and cold. "That's the problem, Clara. Your silence is pathetic. Your presence is an embarrassment. Nathaniel deserves better. He always has." Clara looked at Vanessa, who stood there smiling, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "You brought her here?" Clara's voice cracked. "You brought your mistress to my mother's deathbed?" Nathaniel sighed, like she was being dramatic. "This has nothing to do with Vanessa. This is about you. About your failure as a wife. You've been a burden from the beginning, Clara. I'm just finally doing something about it." Clara's vision blurred. Her hands moved instinctively to her stomach, clutching the small swell she'd been hiding for weeks. "I'm pregnant." The room went silent. Nathaniel froze. Vivian's eyes widened, then narrowed into slits. Vanessa's smile faltered just for a second. Clara's voice shook as she spoke, desperation pouring out of her. "I'm carrying your child, Nathaniel. Doesn't that mean anything to you? Doesn't that change anything?" Nathaniel stared at her, his jaw tight, his eyes cold. And then Vivian spoke, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. "The baby will be better off without you." Clara's heart stopped. "What did you just say?" Nathaniel picked up the folder and held it out to her. "Sign the papers, Clara. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." She couldn't move. She couldn't think. Her mother's body was still warm beside her. Her baby was growing inside her, and her husband was standing there, demanding she give up everything. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Just give me time to bury her. Please, Nathaniel. Just a few days." But he was already walking toward the door. Vivian followed, not even looking back. Vanessa lingered, her eyes sweeping over Clara like she was something broken, something disposable. And then she smiled again, turned, and left. The door clicked shut. Clara collapsed onto the floor, her knees slamming into the cold tile, her hands clutching her stomach as sobs tore through her body. The divorce papers lay scattered around her, soaking up her tears. Her mother was dead. Her husband had abandoned her. And no one was coming to save her. But what none of them knew, what Nathaniel had mocked and Vivian had dismissed and Vanessa had smiled at, was that the woman lying in that hospital bed had been hiding something. Eleanor hadn't been powerless. She hadn't been worthless. She had been something else entirely. And in just a few days, when the will was read, everything would change. But tonight, Clara didn't know that. Tonight, she was just a broken woman on a hospital floor, clutching the last pieces of a life that had been ripped away from her. Could you have survived that? Would you have stayed silent, or would you have fought back right there? Clara sat alone in the small apartment she'd rented with the last of her savings, staring at the divorce papers spread across the table like evidence of a crime she didn't commit. Her mother had been buried 3 days ago in a quiet cemetery on the edge of town, attended only by Clara and a priest who didn't know Eleanor's name. Nathaniel hadn't come. Vivian hadn't sent flowers. Vanessa had probably celebrated. The funeral had been quick, cold, and unbearably lonely. And now Clara was left with nothing but memories and the crushing weight of betrayal pressing down on her chest. She traced her fingers over the papers, reading Nathaniel's signature at the bottom. So casual, so final. Like their marriage had meant nothing. Like she had meant nothing. Her hand moved to her stomach, where the baby was growing, small and fragile, the only thing she had left to protect. "I won't let them take you," she whispered. "I won't let them win." The betrayal hadn't started in that hospital room. It had been built for years, carefully constructed, brick by Nathaniel and Vivian, who had turned cruelty into an art form. Clara had been blind to it at first, or maybe she just wanted to believe that love could survive indifference. She'd met Nathaniel at a charity event 6 years ago, back when she'd been working as an assistant at a small nonprofit. He'd been charming, polite, interested in her work, and when he'd asked her to dinner, she'd said yes without hesitation. The courtship had been fast. Too fast, maybe. Within 6 months, they were engaged. Within a year, they were married. And within 2 years, Clara had realized she'd made a terrible mistake. Nathaniel had never loved her. He'd married her because she was convenient, because she didn't challenge him, because she fit into the life he wanted without demanding anything in return. And Vivian had approved of the match for the same reason. Clara was quiet, obedient, and easy to control. She wouldn't cause problems. She wouldn't ask questions. She would simply exist in the background, a wife in name only, while Nathaniel lived his life however he pleased. The cracks had started small. Nathaniel would forget to tell her about family dinners until the last minute, then blame her for being unprepared when she showed up looking tired. Vivian would make comments about Clara's clothes, her hair, her voice, always framed as advice, but delivered with a smile that made it clear she was being insulted. "You really should try harder, dear," Vivian would say, her voice dripping with false concern. Nathaniel's colleagues have expectations. You wouldn't want to embarrass him. Clara had tried. She'd bought new dresses, changed her hairstyle, practiced smiling in the mirror so she'd look more confident. But it was never enough. Nathaniel would still find something to criticize, something to use as proof that she wasn't fit to be his wife. And every time she tried to defend herself, Vivian would step in with a calm, measured tone that made Clara feel insane for even trying. "You're being dramatic, Clara. No one is attacking you. We're just trying to help." When Eleanor's health started declining, Clara had thought it would be different. She thought Nathaniel would show some compassion, some humanity, some willingness to help the woman who had raised his wife. But she'd been wrong. The first time Clara asked if her mother could move in, Nathaniel had been sitting in his study, going over contracts for a business deal. Clara had knocked softly, waited for permission to enter, and then stood in the doorway, her hands clasped in front of her like a child asking for something she knew she didn't deserve. "Nathaniel, I need to talk to you about my mom." He hadn't looked up from his papers. "What about her?" Clara had stepped closer, her voice quiet but urgent. "She's getting worse. The doctors say she needs someone to take care of her full-time. I was thinking maybe she could move into the guest room, just until she gets better." Nathaniel had finally looked up, his expression neutral, almost bored. "We don't have the space, Clara." She'd blinked, confused. We have 3 guest rooms. We never use them. He'd sighed, setting down his pen like she was wasting his time. It's not about the physical space. It's about the lifestyle we've built. Your mother doesn't fit into that. She'd be uncomfortable here. She'd be a burden. Clara's chest had tightened. She's my mother, Nathaniel. She's not a burden. She's sick. He'd gone back to his papers, dismissing her without another word. Talk to my mother about it. She handles household decisions. So Clara had gone to Vivian, knowing it was a mistake, but hoping, desperately, that maybe she'd find some sympathy there. Vivian had been in the sitting room, sipping tea and reading a magazine, her posture perfect, her expression serene. Clara had sat down across from her, her hands trembling. Vivian, I wanted to ask you about something. Vivian had set down her magazine, her smile polite but cold. Of course, dear. What is it? Clara had explained the situation, trying to keep her voice steady, trying not to sound like she was begging. But halfway through, Vivian had raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. Clara, I understand you're concerned about your mother, but we are not a charity. We have a certain standard to uphold, and bringing in someone who requires constant care would disrupt that. Your mother has her own resources. She can manage on her own. Clara had shaken her head, her voice breaking. She doesn't have resources, Vivian. She's broke. The hospital bills are piling up. She can't afford proper care. She needs help. Vivian had taken another sip of her tea, completely unbothered. Then she should have planned better. Poor financial decisions are not our responsibility, Clara. You need to accept that. Clara had left that conversation feeling like she'd been slapped. But she hadn't given up. She tried again and again and again, each time met with the same cold refusal, the same dismissive logic, the same subtle accusation that she was being unreasonable for even asking. And every time she pushed, Vivian would lean closer to Nathaniel, whispering in his ear, reinforcing the idea that Clara was a problem, that she was weak, that she was dragging them down. Clara had started to notice the way they looked at each other during those conversations, the way Vivian's eyes would flicker with satisfaction when Nathaniel agreed with her, the way they moved in perfect sync, like co-conspirators executing a plan. They weren't just refusing to help Eleanor. They were orchestrating Clara's isolation piece by piece, ensuring she had no support, no power, no way to fight back. So Clara had done the only thing she could. She'd started visiting her mother in secret, paying the bills with money she'd saved from years of small sacrifices. She'd sold the necklace her mother had given her for her birthday. She'd skipped meals to save grocery money. She'd hidden receipts in the lining of her purse, tucked hospital statements under the mattress, and lied to Nathaniel about where she was going every time she left the house. I'm running errands, she'd say, and he'd nod, not caring enough to ask follow-up questions. Vivian never questioned her either. They were content to let Clara disappear for hours at a time, as long as she came back quiet, obedient, and broken. And she had been broken. Every visit to the hospital had chipped away at her spirit. Every time she'd watched her mother struggle to breathe, struggle to stay awake, struggle to hold on, Clara had felt the weight of her own powerlessness crushing her. She couldn't save her mother. She couldn't stand up to Nathaniel. She couldn't escape Vivian's control. She was trapped, and they knew it. But what Clara hadn't realized, what she couldn't have known during those long, painful months, was that her mother had been preparing for this. Eleanor had watched her daughter suffer in silence, had seen the bruises on her spirit even when there were no marks on her skin, and she had made a plan. A plan so carefully constructed, so meticulously hidden, that no one, not even Clara, would see it coming until the exact moment it needed to be revealed. Eleanor had been poor in appearance, yes. She'd lived in a small apartment, worn old clothes, and never flaunted wealth. But appearances had been her shield, her disguise, her way of protecting what she'd built in secret. And now, lying in a grave on the edge of town, Eleanor's final act of love was about to unfold. Nathaniel and Vivian had spent years dismantling Clara's confidence, her hope, her sense of self-worth. They had whispered lies, planted doubts, and celebrated every moment she'd bent under the weight of their cruelty. Vanessa had waited patiently in the shadows, smiling, knowing her time was coming. But none of them had accounted for Eleanor. None of them had considered that the woman they dismissed, ignored, and sent away to die alone might have been hiding the one thing that could destroy them all. And Clara, sitting in that tiny apartment with divorce papers in front of her and a baby growing inside her, had no idea that the war they'd started was about to turn in her favor. Could you have kept going after everything they did to her? Would you have fought back, or would you have given up? Clara's daughter was born on a rainy Tuesday morning in April, 3 weeks earlier than expected. The labor had been brutal, lasting 14 hours, and Clara had gone through it alone in a hospital room with peeling paint and flickering lights. No husband, no mother-in-law. No one was holding her hand or telling her she was strong. Just Clara, the nurses, and the overwhelming pain that felt like her body was being ripped apart. When the baby finally came, when the nurse placed that tiny, screaming bundle in her arms, Clara had felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about protection. This was about making sure her daughter never felt the kind of pain Clara had endured. She looked down at the baby's face, red and scrunched up and perfect, and whispered through her tears, "I'm going to keep you safe. I promise. No matter what it takes." But even as she said it, Clara knew the fight was only beginning. Nathaniel wasn't going to let her go quietly. He wanted control, and now that there was a child involved, he had leverage. The custody battle started before Clara even left the hospital. She'd been in her room for less than 24 hours, still bleeding, still exhausted, when a man in a suit knocked on her door and handed her an envelope. "Clara Whitmore," he'd asked, his voice flat and professional. She nodded, too tired to question it. He'd placed the envelope on her bedside table and left without another word. Clara had stared at it for a long time before opening it, her hands shaking, her heart pounding. Inside were legal documents, stamped and signed, filed by Nathaniel's attorney. He was suing for full custody. The papers claimed Clara was mentally unstable, financially unfit, and emotionally incapable of raising a child. They cited her recent traumatic loss and history of erratic behavior as evidence that she posed a danger to the baby. Clara's vision blurred as she read the words, her chest tightening with panic. They were taking her daughter. They were going to take the only thing she had left. She called the one lawyer she could afford, a woman named Margaret Chun, who worked out of a cramped office above a dry cleaner. Margaret had been blunt from the start. "Clara, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. Nathaniel has money, connections, and a team of attorneys who do this for a living. You're fighting uphill." Clara had gripped the phone so hard her knuckles turned white. "I don't care. I'll do whatever it takes. He's not taking my daughter." Margaret had paused, then sighed. "Okay. Then we need to be smart. We need to document everything. Every interaction, every threat, every lie. We need to show the court who he really is." Clara had nodded, even though Margaret couldn't see her. "I can do that. I will do that." And she had. From that moment on, Clara became a different person. She kept notebooks filled with dates, times, and details of every conversation with Nathaniel. She saved text messages, recorded phone calls, and gathered witnesses who had seen the way he treated her. She was meticulous, deliberate, and relentless, because losing wasn't an option. Nathaniel's first move was to paint Clara as unstable. His lawyers filed motions claiming she was suffering from postpartum depression, that she was neglecting the baby, that she was living in unsafe conditions. Vivian backed him up with sworn statements, testifying that Clara had always been emotionally fragile and incapable of handling responsibility. She described Clara as someone who cried constantly, who couldn't make decisions, who needed constant supervision. It was a lie, all of it, but Vivian delivered it with such calm authority that it sounded like the truth. Vanessa played her part too, positioning herself as the stable, supportive figure the child needed. She attended hearings with Nathaniel, dressed impeccably, smiling at the judge, playing the role of the devoted partner who only wanted what was best for the baby. Clara watched from across the courtroom, her stomach churning, her fists clenched, knowing exactly what they were doing. They were erasing her. They were rewriting the story to make her the villain and themselves the heroes. But Clara had something they didn't expect. She had the truth. And she had Margaret, who knew how to fight dirty when it mattered. Margaret dug into Nathaniel's past and found the hospital records from the night Eleanor died. She found the divorce papers he'd served Clara while her mother's body was still warm. She found text messages between Nathaniel and Vanessa that proved the affair had been going on long before Clara's pregnancy. And she found witnesses, nurses who had been there that night, who remembered Nathaniel's coldness, Vivian's cruelty, and Vanessa's smile. Margaret presented it all to the court, piece by piece, building a case that showed Nathaniel not as a concerned father, but as a manipulative man who had abandoned his pregnant wife at her lowest moment. The judge had listened, stone-faced, as Margaret laid it all out. And when Nathaniel's lawyer tried to argue that Clara's grief made her unfit, Margaret stood up and said, "Your Honor, grief is not a crime. Abandoning your pregnant wife at her mother's deathbed is." The courtroom had gone silent. Nathaniel's face had turned red. Vivian had shifted in her seat, her jaw tight. Vanessa had stopped smiling. And Clara had felt, for the first time in months, like maybe she had a chance. But Nathaniel didn't give up. He escalated. He filed motions claiming Clara was hiding assets, that she was uncooperative, that she was poisoning the child against him even though the baby was barely 3 months old. He demanded supervised visitation, drug tests, psychological evaluations. He threw everything he had at her, trying to bury her under paperwork and legal fees, trying to exhaust her until she gave up. Vivian called Clara's landlord, trying to get her evicted. She contacted Clara's former employer, spreading rumors that Clara was unstable and unreliable. She even showed up at Clara's apartment once, unannounced, claiming she wanted to check on the baby, but really just trying to find something she could use against Clara in court. Clara had stood in the doorway, blocking her entry, her voice steady despite the rage burning in her chest. "You're not coming in, Vivian. You have no right to be here." Vivian had smiled, cold and sharp. "I have every right, dear. That child is my grandchild. And when Nathaniel wins custody, you'll never see her again." Clara had closed the door in her face, her hands shaking, her heart racing. But she hadn't broken. She'd gone back inside, picked up her daughter, and held her close, whispering the same promise she'd made in the hospital. "I won't let them take you. I won't let them win." And she hadn't. Every move Nathaniel made, Clara countered. Every lie Vivian told, Clara exposed. Every time they tried to paint her as weak, she showed up stronger. She attended every hearing, every mediation, every evaluation, and she did it with her head held high, even when she was falling apart inside. She learned to speak in court without her voice shaking. She learned to answer questions without crying. She learned to be the kind of mother her daughter needed, even when everything inside her was screaming to collapse. Margaret had warned her it would be a long fight, and she'd been right. Months passed. The legal bills piled up. Clara sold everything she had left, her mother's furniture, her wedding ring, even the few pieces of jewelry she'd been saving for her daughter. She worked 2 jobs, one during the day and one at night, sleeping only a few hours between shifts, surviving on coffee and sheer willpower. Her body ached. Her mind was exhausted. But she kept going, because giving up meant losing her daughter, and that was something she would never do. She remembered her mother's words from that hospital bed. "Be strong, Clara, even when I'm gone, especially when I'm gone." And Clara had been strong. Stronger than she'd ever thought possible. Stronger than Nathaniel had anticipated. Stronger than Vivian had believed she could be. What Clara didn't know, what she couldn't have known during those brutal months of fighting, was that her mother had left her more than just words. Eleanor had left her a weapon. A tool so powerful it would dismantle everything Nathaniel and Vivian had built. But the time wasn't right yet. Clara had to prove herself first. She had to show the world, and more importantly herself, that she didn't need money or power to be strong. She needed only her will, her love, and her refusal to break. And as the custody battle dragged on, as Nathaniel's lawyers filed motion after motion, as Vivian whispered threats and Vanessa played the perfect stepmother, Clara kept fighting. She kept showing up. She kept proving that no amount of money, no amount of manipulation could take away what mattered most. Her daughter was hers. And no judge, no lawyer, no amount of cruelty could change that. The final custody hearing was scheduled for late September, 6 months after her daughter was born. Clara walked into that courtroom with her head high, her evidence organized, her witnesses ready. Nathaniel sat across from her with his team of lawyers, Vivian beside him, Vanessa close by, all of them confident, all of them certain they would win. But Clara wasn't afraid anymore. She'd been through the worst they could throw at her, and she was still standing. And soon, very soon, they would realize they'd made a terrible mistake. Could you have fought that hard for someone you loved? Would you have kept going when everyone said you'd lose? The letter arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, slipped under Clara's apartment door while she was feeding her daughter. She'd almost missed it, nearly stepped right over it on her way to throw out the trash. But something made her stop, made her look down, and there it was. A cream-colored envelope, thick and expensive looking, with her name written across the front in elegant handwriting she didn't recognize. Clara picked it up, her heart beating faster, her fingers trembling as she turned it over. There was no return address, just a wax seal pressed into the back, dark red and official. She'd never seen anything like it. She carried it to the table, set her daughter down in the bassinet, and stared at the envelope for a long moment before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded carefully, and a business card. The card was simple, black ink on white stock, with a name and phone number. Henry Caldwell, attorney at law. Clara's stomach dropped. Another lawyer. Another legal threat. She almost threw it away without reading the letter, but something stopped her. This didn't feel like Nathaniel's doing. This felt different. She unfolded the letter and started reading. Dear Clara, you do not know me, but I have been entrusted with matters concerning your late mother, Eleanor Hartley. There are details regarding her estate that require your immediate attention. Please contact my office at your earliest convenience. This is a matter of great importance and confidentiality. Sincerely, Henry Caldwell. Clara read it twice, then 3 times, trying to make sense of it. Estate? Her mother didn't have an estate. Eleanor had died with nothing but medical debt and a closet full of worn clothes. There had been no savings, no property, no assets to speak of. Clara had paid for the funeral with money she'd borrowed from Margaret, and she was still paying it back in small installments. What could this lawyer possibly want? She looked at the business card again, at the phone number printed neatly across the bottom. Part of her wanted to ignore it, to throw it away and pretend it had never arrived. She didn't have the energy for more legal complications, more paperwork, more people trying to take things from her. But another part of her, the part that sounded like her mother's voice in her head, told her to call. Be strong, Clara, even when I'm gone. So she picked up her phone and dialed the number. It rang twice before a woman answered. Caldwell and Associates, how may I help you? Clara's voice came out shaky. Hi, my name is Clara Whitmore. I received a letter from Henry Caldwell. He asked me to call. There was a pause, then the sound of papers shuffling. Yes, Mrs. Whitmore. Mr. Caldwell has been expecting your call. Please hold on. The line clicked and soft classical music played in Clara's ear. She waited, her pulse racing, her mind spinning with questions she didn't have answers to. After what felt like forever, a man's voice came on the line, deep and calm. Mrs. Whitmore, thank you for calling. My name is Henry Caldwell. I've been handling your mother's affairs. Clara's throat tightened. I don't understand. My mother didn't have any affairs to handle. She died with nothing. There was a pause, and when Henry spoke again, his voice was softer, almost gentle. Mrs. Whitmore, I think it would be best if we met in person. There are things I need to explain to you. Things your mother wanted kept confidential until the right time. Can you come to my office tomorrow? Clara's hands shook. I don't know. I have a baby. I'm in the middle of a custody battle. I can't just drop everything and, Henry interrupted, his tone firm but kind. Mrs. Whitmore, I understand you're going through a difficult time, but I promise you, this is worth your time. Your mother left instructions. Very specific instructions. And she made it clear that you were not to learn about any of this until after her passing. Clara's chest tightened. Learn about what? Henry hesitated, then said quietly, your mother's estate. Her assets. Her legacy. She left everything to you, Clara. And it's far more than you realize. Clara's breath caught. What are you talking about? My mother had nothing. We struggled our entire lives. She died in a public hospital because we couldn't afford anything better. Henry's voice was steady, careful. That's what she wanted people to believe. But the truth is very different. Please, Mrs. Whitmore, come to my office. Let me show you what your mother built. The next day, Clara stood outside a glass high-rise in the financial district, holding her daughter against her chest, staring up at the building like it might swallow her whole. She'd taken 2 buses to get here, dressed in the only clean shirt she had left, her hair pulled back in a ponytail because she didn't have time to do anything else. She felt out of place, like she didn't belong in a world of polished lobbies and people in expensive suits. But she'd come this far. She couldn't turn back now. She pushed through the revolving door and walked to the reception desk, her heart pounding. I'm here to see Henry Caldwell, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The receptionist smiled, professional and detached. Name. Clara swallowed. Clara Whitmore. The woman typed something into her computer, then nodded. 15th floor. Mr. Caldwell is expecting you. Clara rode the elevator in silence, her daughter asleep in her arms, her mind racing. When the doors opened, she stepped into a quiet hallway lined with dark wood and soft lighting. At the end of the hall was a door with a gold plaque that read Henry Caldwell, attorney at law. She knocked, and a voice called out, come in. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The office was large, filled with bookshelves and leather furniture. A massive desk in the center with a man sitting behind it. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with gray hair and kind eyes. He stood when he saw her, smiling warmly. Mrs. Whitmore, thank you for coming. Please sit. Clara sat, her daughter stirring slightly, but staying asleep. Henry sat back down, folding his hands on the desk. I know this must be confusing for you, he said gently. But I'm going to explain everything. Your mother came to me 20 years ago. She hired me to manage her assets, her investments, her properties. She was very clear about what she wanted. No one knew. Not her friend S. Not her family. Not even you. She lived modestly, quietly, because she believed that wealth attracted the wrong kind of attention. She wanted to protect you, Clara. And she wanted to make sure that when the time came, you would have everything you needed to survive. Clara's head was spinning. I don't understand. What assets? What properties? My mother lived in a 1-bedroom apartment. She worked as a cleaner. She had nothing. Henry opened a drawer and pulled out a thick folder, setting it on the desk between them. That's what she wanted people to believe. But your mother was a very intelligent woman. She invested carefully. She bought properties under different names. She built businesses quietly, always staying in the background. And over the course of 30 years, she accumulated significant wealth. He opened the folder and slid a document across the desk. Clara looked down at it, her eyes scanning the numbers, and her heart stopped. That can't be right, she whispered. Henry nodded. It is. Your mother's estate is worth $10 billion. And as of today, it all belongs to you. Clara couldn't breathe. She stared at the document, at the number written there in black ink, and her mind went blank. $10 billion. $10 billion. It didn't make sense. It couldn't be real. How? She asked, her voice breaking. How did she do this? Henry leaned back in his chair. Your mother was brilliant, Clara. She saw opportunities where others didn't. She invested in real estate when it was cheap. She bought shares in companies before they went public. She built partnerships with people who trusted her judgment. And she did it all without drawing attention to herself. She lived below her means, saved every dollar, and reinvested everything. She was patient, strategic, and most importantly, she was disciplined. She never spent more than she needed to. She never showed off. She never let anyone know what she had. because she knew that the moment people found out, they would try to take it from her. Clara's hands shook as she held the document. Why didn't she tell me? Why didn't she let me help her? I could have. Henry shook his head gently. She didn't want you to know, because she knew what it would do to you. She knew the people in your life would try to use it against you. Your husband, your mother-in-law. She saw what they were doing to you, Clara. She saw how they treated you, how they isolated you, how they tried to break you. And she knew that if they found out about the money, they would destroy you. To get to it. So she waited. She waited until she was gone, until you were free from them, until you were strong enough to handle it. And now here you are. Clara's vision blurred with tears. She thought about all the times she'd begged Nathaniel to help her mother, all the times she'd been refused, all the nights she'd spent crying because she couldn't afford proper care. And her mother had been sitting on billions, hiding it, protecting it, waiting for the right moment. She could have told me, Clara whispered. She could have made things easier. Henry's voice was soft. She wanted you to be strong, Clara. She wanted you to learn how to survive without money, without power, without anyone's help. Because she knew that the moment you inherited this, everyone would come for you. And she needed you to be ready. He slid another document across the desk. This is the will. Everything is outlined here. The properties, the investments, the businesses. And there's something else. Your mother purchased the hospital where she died. She bought it 6 months before her passing. She wanted you to have control over it. She wanted you to fix it, to make it better, to make sure no one else ever had to suffer the way she did. Clara looked down at the will, at her mother's signature at the bottom, and she felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just money. This was power. This was justice. This was everything she needed to protect her daughter and destroy the people who had tried to destroy her. When do I get access to it? She asked, her voice steady now. Henry smiled. As soon as you sign these documents, everything transfers to you. But Clara, I need you to understand something. The moment you do this, your life changes. Nathaniel will know. Vivian will know. Vanessa will know. And they will come for you. They will fight. They will lie. They will do everything they can to take this from you. Are you ready for that? Clara looked down at her daughter, sleeping peacefully in her arms, and she thought about everything she'd been through. The hospital room, the divorce papers, the custody battle, the endless nights of fear and exhaustion. And she thought about her mother, who had endured silently, who had built an empire in secret, who had given Clara the one thing she needed most, a chance. She looked up at Henry, her eyes clear, her voice strong. I'm ready. The reading of Eleanor's will was scheduled for exactly 2 weeks after Clara signed the documents in Henry Caldwell's office. Henry had insisted on making it public, on gathering everyone who had a stake in Eleanor's life, or at least everyone who thought they did. Your mother wanted this, he told Clara over the phone. She wanted them to see it. She wanted them to understand what they'd lost. Clara had hesitated at first, unsure if she could face Nathaniel, Vivian, and Vanessa in the same room without breaking down. But then she'd remembered the hospital room, the divorce papers placed on her mother's deathbed, the custody battle that had nearly destroyed her, and she'd agreed. Let them see. Let them know. Let them feel every ounce of the pain they'd caused. The reading was held in a conference room at Caldwell and Associates, on the same 15th floor where Clara had first learned the truth. She arrived early, dressed in a simple black dress her mother had bought her years ago, her daughter asleep in a carrier strapped to her chest. Henry was already there, arranging papers on the long mahogany table, his expression calm and professional. He looked up when she entered and gave her a small, reassuring nod. Are you ready? He asked quietly. Clara took a deep breath and nodded. I'm ready. The others arrived 15 minutes later. Nathaniel walked in first, his suit perfectly tailored, his expression confident, almost bored, like this was just another business meeting he had to endure. Vivian followed, her head held high, her eyes scanning the room with practiced disdain. And then came Vanessa, dressed in a pale blue dress that was too expensive, too polished, too deliberate. She saw Clara and smiled, that same cold, satisfied smile she'd worn in the hospital room. Clara's stomach churned, but she kept her face neutral, her hands resting gently on her daughter's back. Nathaniel took a seat across from Clara without acknowledging her. Vivian sat beside him, smoothing her skirt with precise, controlled movements. Vanessa lingered near the door for a moment before sitting next to Nathaniel, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Henry waited until everyone was settled, then cleared his throat. Thank you all for coming. We're here today for the reading of Eleanor Hartley's last will and testament. As her attorney, I've been entrusted with ensuring her wishes are carried out exactly as she intended. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. Let's get this over with. I have a meeting at 3. Henry didn't react to the dismissiveness. He simply opened the folder in front of him and began reading. Eleanor Hartley, being of sound mind and body, hereby declares this to be her last will and testament. To my daughter Clara Whitmore, I leave the entirety of my estate, including all properties, investments, bank accounts, and business holdings, valued at $10 billion. The room went silent. Nathaniel's arms dropped. Vivian's eyes widened. Vanessa's smile disappeared. Clara sat perfectly still, watching them, her heart pounding, but her expression calm. Nathaniel was the first to speak, his voice tight, controlled. I'm sorry. Did you just say 10 billion? Henry nodded. Yes. $10 billion. Eleanor Hartley built a significant financial empire over the course of 30 years, all of which she has left to her daughter. Vivian's face had gone pale. She leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of the table. That's impossible. Eleanor was poor. She lived in a terrible apartment. She died in a public hospital. She had nothing. Henry's voice remained calm, almost clinical. That's what she wanted people to believe. But Eleanor owned multiple properties across the country, held controlling shares in several major companies, and maintained investment portfolios that generated substantial passive income. She lived modestly by choice, not necessity. Nathaniel stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This is insane. There's no way that woman had $10 billion. She was a cleaner. She barely spoke English. She was nothing. Henry's eyes hardened just slightly. She was a brilliant investor and a strategic thinker who chose to live quietly to protect what she'd built. And now, everything she worked for belongs to Clara. Vivian turned to Clara, her voice sharp, accusing. You knew about this. You've been hiding it this whole time, playing the victim while sitting on a fortune. Clara finally spoke, her voice steady, cold. I found out 2 weeks ago. The same time you're finding out now. My mother kept it from everyone, including me, because she knew exactly what people like you would do if you found out. Vanessa stood up, her face flushed, her hands shaking. This isn't fair. Nathaniel was married to you. He has rights. We have rights. Henry shook his head. No, you don't. The marriage was legally dissolved before Eleanor's passing. Nathaniel has no claim to Clara's inheritance. And even if he did, Eleanor's will is ironclad. Every asset is in Clara's name. There are no loopholes, no contested clauses, no grounds for appeal. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. He looked at Clara. And for the first time, she saw something other than indifference in his eyes. She saw panic. Clara, we need to talk about this. This changes things. We can work something out. The custody arrangement, the divorce settlement, we can renegotiate. Clara stared at him, her voice ice cold. No. Nathaniel blinked. What? Clara's voice didn't waver. I said no. You served me divorce papers while my mother was dying. You abandoned me while I was pregnant. You fought to take my daughter from me because you thought I was weak, powerless, and alone. You were wrong. And now you want to renegotiate? Now you want to talk? It's too late, Nathaniel. You made your choice. Vivian stood up, her voice rising. You ungrateful little, Henry interrupted, his voice sharp. Mrs. Whitmore, I suggest you sit down. Anything you say in this room can and will be documented. Clara has grounds to pursue legal action for harassment, defamation, and emotional distress. I'd advise you to be very careful with your words. Vivian's mouth snapped shut. She sat down slowly, her face twisted with rage. Vanessa was still standing, her hands clenched into fists, her breathing shallow. "This isn't over," she said, her voice shaking. "We'll fight this. We'll take you to court. We'll prove you manipulated her, that you tricked her into leaving everything to you." Henry pulled out another document and slid it across the table. Eleanor anticipated that response. This is a letter she wrote, dated 3 months before her death, outlining her reasons for leaving everything to Clara. She describes in detail the neglect she experienced, the refusal of support from Nathaniel and Vivian, and the isolation Clara endured during her marriage. She also mentions you, Miss Vanessa, and the affair you conducted with Nathaniel while Clara was pregnant. This letter has been notarized, witnessed, and filed with the court. If you attempt to contest the will, this becomes public record. Vanessa's face went white. She sank back into her chair, her hands trembling. Nathaniel stared at the document, his expression blank, like his mind was trying to catch up with what was happening. Vivian looked like she might faint. Her breathing was shallow, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. Henry continued, his voice calm and measured. Additionally, Eleanor purchased the hospital, where she passed away 6 months before her death. As of today, Clara owns that facility. She also owns the businesses that supply medical equipment to that hospital, the real estate company that manages the properties Nathaniel's family rents for their offices, and the investment firm that holds the majority of Vivian's personal accounts. The room was so quiet Clara could hear her daughter's soft breathing against her chest. Nathaniel looked at her, his eyes wide, his voice barely a whisper. "You own everything." Clara nodded. "Not everything. Just everything that matters to you." Vivian made a small, choked sound, like she was trying to speak but couldn't find the words. Vanessa was staring at the table, her face buried in her hands. Nathaniel sat down slowly, his confidence shattered, his posture slumped. Henry closed the folder. "That concludes the reading. Clara, if you have any questions, I'm available. The rest of you are free to leave." No one moved. They all just sat there, stunned, broken, unable to process what had just happened. Clara stood, adjusting her daughter in the carrier, and walked toward the door. She paused when she reached Nathaniel, looking down at him. "You told me I'd never be anything without you," she said quietly. "You told me I was weak, that I was worthless, that my mother was a burden. You were wrong about all of it." She turned and walked out, leaving them sitting in silence, their world collapsing around them. Outside the building, Clara stood on the sidewalk, breathing in the cold air, feeling the weight of everything that had just happened settle over her. She'd won. She'd actually won. Not just the money, not just the power, but the validation, the proof that she'd been right all along, that she'd been strong enough to survive, that her mother's love had been real and fierce and unstoppable. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a text from Margaret. Heard the news. The court just dropped Nathaniel's custody case. Full custody awarded to you. Congratulations, Clara. Clara closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face, and she whispered, "Thank you, Mom. Thank you for everything." Her daughter stirred, opening her eyes and looking up at Clara with that innocent, trusting gaze. Clara smiled through her tears and kissed her forehead. "We're safe now, baby. We're finally safe." Inside the conference room, Nathaniel sat frozen, staring at the table. Vivian had her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking. Vanessa was crying openly now, mascara running down her cheeks. Henry gathered his papers, his expression neutral, professional. As he walked past Nathaniel, he paused. "Your ex-wife is a remarkable woman," he said quietly. "You should have realized that before you lost her." And then he left, closing the door behind him, leaving them alone with the wreckage of their own cruelty. Could you have stayed as calm as Clara did in that room? Would you have been able to walk away, or would you have said more? Clara's new life didn't announce itself with fanfare or celebration. There were no champagne toasts, no shopping sprees, no sudden transformations into someone she wasn't. Instead, she moved through the transition with the same quiet determination that had carried her through the custody battle, through the divorce, through the hospital room where her mother had died. She rented a modest apartment in a better neighborhood, nothing extravagant, just a place where her daughter could grow up safely, where the locks worked and the heat stayed on, and no one banged on the walls at 3 in the morning. She hired a nanny, a kind woman named Rosa, who had raised 4 children of her own and treated Clara's daughter like she was precious. And then, with Henry's guidance, Clara began the real work. The work her mother had prepared her for. The work of rebuilding everything Nathaniel and Vivian had tried to destroy. She started with the hospital, the place where Eleanor had died alone, neglected, treated like she didn't matter. Clara walked through those halls 3 weeks after the will reading, her heels clicking against the linoleum floors, and she saw everything her mother must have seen. Overworked nurses, broken equipment, patients waited for hours in hallways because there weren't enough beds. A system built on cutting costs instead of saving lives. She called a meeting with the hospital board, a group of men in expensive suits who'd been running the place into the ground for years while collecting fat paychecks. They'd gathered in the boardroom, expecting some kind of introduction, maybe a polite speech about continuing her mother's legacy. Instead, Clara had walked in, set her bag down, and said, "You're all fired." The room had gone silent. One of the board members, a man named Gerald with a red face and a condescending smile, had laughed. "Excuse me." Clara had looked at him, her expression calm, her voice steady. "I said you're all fired. Effective immediately. Security will escort you out. You have 1 hour to clear your offices." Gerald's smile had disappeared. "You can't do that. We have contracts." Henry, who'd been standing quietly in the corner, had stepped forward and placed a stack of documents on the table. Those contracts have termination clauses for gross negligence and mismanagement. Miss Whitmore's legal team has documented every violation, every safety issue, every patient complaint that was ignored under your leadership. You're lucky she's not pressing criminal charges. Another board member, a woman named Diane, had stood up, her voice sharp. "This is insane. You don't know anything about running a hospital. You're going to destroy this place." Clara had met her eyes without flinching. "My mother died in this place because people like you decided saving money was more important than saving lives. I'm not destroying anything. I'm fixing what you broke." Within a month, Clara had hired new leadership, people who actually cared about patient care, who'd spent their careers fighting for better conditions, better pay, better treatment. She increased salaries for nurses and support staff, invested in new equipment, and renovated entire wings that had been falling apart for years. She didn't do it for recognition or praise. She did it because her mother had suffered here, and Clara would make sure no one else ever had to. Word spread quickly. The local news ran a story about the hospital's transformation, about the anonymous donor who'd taken over and turned everything around. Clara stayed out of the spotlight, refusing interviews, letting the work speak for itself. But people noticed. Employees noticed. Patients noticed. And Nathaniel noticed. He'd started calling her 2 weeks after the will reading, leaving voicemails that started polite and got progressively more desperate. "Clara, we need to talk. There are things we can work out. I made mistakes, I know that, but we can fix this." She never called him back. Then the text started. Long, rambling messages about how he'd been under pressure, how Vivian had influenced him, how he regretted everything. Clara deleted them without reading past the first line. Vivian tried a different approach. She showed up at Clara's apartment one evening, unannounced, ringing the doorbell until Clara finally opened the door with her daughter on her hip. Vivian stood there, dressed impeccably as always, but there was something different in her eyes. Desperation. "Clara, we need to talk." Clara didn't move from the doorway. "No, we don't." Vivian's voice cracked, just slightly. "Please. Just 5 minutes. I know I was wrong. I know I hurt you. But we're family. We can move past this." Clara's voice was ice. "We were never family, Vivian. You made sure of that." Vivian's composure slipped. "You're going to destroy us. Nathaniel's business is failing. Our accounts are frozen. We're losing everything." Clara shifted her daughter to her other hip, her expression unchanging. "You should have thought about that before you sent my mother to die alone in a public hospital. Before you told me my baby would be better off without me. Before you spent years making me feel like I was nothing. Vivian's eyes filled with tears, real or fake. Clara couldn't tell and didn't care. I'm begging you. Please. Just help us. You have so much now. You don't need all of it. Clara's voice was quiet but firm. You're right. I don't need all of it. But I'm not giving you a single dollar. Not now. Not ever. Goodbye, Vivian. And she closed the door. Nathaniel's attempts became more public, more humiliating. He tried to contact Clara's lawyers, demanding meetings, threatening lawsuits, claiming she was using her wealth to manipulate the legal system. Henry shut him down every time, sending polite but firm letters that reminded Nathaniel he had no legal standing, no claim, no leverage. Then Nathaniel tried going to the press, giving an interview to a tabloid about how his ex-wife had suddenly come into money and was refusing to help the father of her child. The article painted Clara as cold, vindictive, a woman who'd turned her back on her family. It lasted exactly one day before Henry released Eleanor's letter, the one describing in detail how Nathaniel and Vivian had treated her, how they'd refused to help when she was dying, how they'd served divorce papers at her deathbed. The media turned on Nathaniel overnight. Op-eds called him cruel, heartless, a man who'd abandoned his pregnant wife and now wanted her money. Social media tore him apart. His business partners started distancing themselves. Invitations to events dried up. And through it all, Clara said nothing. She didn't defend herself, didn't issue statements, didn't engage. She just kept moving forward, kept building, kept protecting her daughter. Vanessa tried her own approach, reaching out through mutual acquaintances, suggesting they meet for coffee, pretending she wanted to apologize. Clara ignored every attempt. Vanessa then tried showing up at the hospital, claiming she wanted to volunteer, to give back to the community. Clara had security escort her out. She's not welcome here, Clara had told the head of security. If she comes back, call the police. Vanessa's social circle began to shrink. The women who'd once envied her relationship with Nathaniel, who'd admired her patience and strategy, now saw her for what she was. A woman who'd smiled while a pregnant wife was being destroyed. Invitations stopped coming. Friends stopped calling. And when Vanessa tried to align herself with other wealthy families, whispers followed her everywhere. That's the mistress. That's the woman who broke up a marriage. That's the one who smiled at a deathbed. Clara never had to say a word. The truth did all the work for her. But Clara's focus wasn't on revenge. It was on building something better. She took over the businesses her mother had quietly invested in, bringing in ethical leadership, implementing fair wages, creating environments where employees were valued instead of exploited. She funded scholarships for single mothers trying to get back on their feet, for women escaping abusive relationships, for people who reminded her of where she'd been just months ago. She did it quietly, without press releases or photo opportunities, because the work mattered more than the recognition. Her daughter grew stronger every day, smiling more, laughing more, thriving in a home filled with love instead of fear. Clara would sit with her in the evenings, reading stories, singing songs, and sometimes just holding her close, whispering promises. You're safe. You're loved. You're never going to know what it feels like to be powerless. And she meant it. Nathaniel's business collapsed by autumn. The investments he'd relied on, the partnerships he'd counted on, all of them were connected to companies Clara now controlled. She didn't actively destroy him. She just stopped supporting him. Contracts weren't renewed. Partnerships dissolved. Buildings he'd been renting were sold to other tenants. It wasn't revenge. It was simply removing the safety net he'd always taken for granted. Vivian's social standing crumbled alongside her son's business. The charity board she'd sat on quietly asked her to step down. The country club she'd frequented for decades revoked her membership. The invitations to galas and fundraisers stopped arriving. She'd built her entire identity on status, on being untouchable, on controlling the people around her. And now, watching it all disappear, she had no one to blame but herself. Clara heard about it all through Henry, who kept her updated not because she asked, but because he believed she should know. Nathaniel filed for bankruptcy last week. He told her over coffee one afternoon. Vivian sold her house. They're both living in a small apartment downtown. Clara had taken a sip of her coffee, her expression neutral. Good. Henry had smiled just slightly. Your mother would be proud of you, Clara. But Clara didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel victorious. She just felt steady, grounded, like she was finally standing on solid ground after years of sinking. She'd survived the worst they could throw at her, and she'd come out stronger. Not because of the money, not because of the power, but because she'd learned what her mother had been trying to teach her all along. Strength wasn't about being loud or aggressive. It was about being patient, strategic, and unshakable. It was about protecting what mattered and letting everything else fall away. And as Clara sat in her apartment watching her daughter sleep, she realized she'd become exactly the kind of woman her mother had always believed she could be. Strong, resilient, unstoppable. How would you have handled the power if you were in Clara's position? Would you have been as restrained, or would you have gone further? Vanessa had always believed patience was her greatest weapon. While other women chased men with tears and demands, she'd waited in the shadows, smiling politely, never pushing, never asking for more than Nathaniel was willing to give. She'd watched Clara struggle through pregnancy, watched her beg for help, watched her cry in corners at family dinners, and Vanessa had smiled through all of it because she knew her time was coming. She'd convinced herself that once Clara was gone, once the divorce was final, she'd step into the life that should have always been hers. Nathaniel's wealth, his status, his family name, all of it would belong to her. She'd played the long game, and she'd been certain she'd won. But now, sitting in her cramped studio apartment with unpaid bills stacked on the counter, and her phone silent for the third day in a row, Vanessa realized she'd been playing a game where the rules had changed without anyone telling her. Clara hadn't just survived. She'd risen. And Vanessa, who'd spent years positioning herself as the better choice, the smarter choice, the woman Nathaniel deserved, was left with nothing. The collapse had started slowly, so subtly Vanessa hadn't noticed it at first. After the will reading, after the news broke about Clara's inheritance, Vanessa had still believed she could salvage things. She'd gone to Nathaniel, found him sitting in his office with his head in his hands, and she'd wrapped her arms around him, whispered reassurances. We'll figure this out. Clara can't keep all of it. There are laws, protections, we'll fight this. But Nathaniel had pulled away from her, his voice hollow. There's nothing to fight. She owns everything. My business, my properties, the accounts I thought were mine. It's all connected to companies she controls now. I have nothing, Vanessa. Nothing. Vanessa had tried to stay calm, tried to be the supportive partner she'd always been. Then we'll rebuild. We'll start over. You're smart, capable, you can do this. But Nathaniel had looked at her with empty eyes. With what money? With what connections? Everyone I knew, everyone who mattered, they're all gone. They don't return my calls. They don't want to be associated with me. I'm toxic, Vanessa. And so are you. That had stung. But Vanessa had pushed past it, convinced he was just stressed, just overwhelmed. She tried reaching out to her own network, the women she'd befriended at charity events, the investors she'd charmed at dinner parties. But the responses had been cold, distant, polite rejections wrapped in excuses. We're not taking on new partnerships right now. I'll have my assistant get back to you. Let's reconnect in a few months. Vanessa had felt the shift, the way people who'd once smiled at her now looked past her, through her, like she was invisible. She'd been Nathaniel's mistress, the woman who'd helped destroy a marriage, and now that Nathaniel was worthless, so was she. The invitations stopped coming. The lunch dates were canceled. The phone calls went unanswered. Vanessa had spent years building relationships based on what Nathaniel could offer, and now that he had nothing, those relationships evaporated like they'd never existed. She tried working, applying for positions at firms where she'd once been considered a valuable contact. But her resume, once impressive because of her connections, now fell hollow. She had no real skills, no tangible experience, just years of networking and social climbing that meant nothing without the right name attached to her. The interviews were polite but brief. We'll be in touch. They never were. Vanessa's savings, which she'd thought would last months, drained faster than she'd expected. Rent, utilities, groceries, all the small expenses she'd never worried about when Nathaniel was paying for everything. She'd never realized how much she depended on him, how much her entire life had been built on his wealth. And now, watching her bank account dwindle, watching the creditors call, watching her carefully constructed life crumble, Vanessa felt something she'd never felt before. Fear. Real, suffocating fear that she was going to lose everything. She tried reaching out to Clara once, through a mutual acquaintance who worked at one of the hospitals Clara had restructured. Vanessa had crafted the message carefully, making it sound genuine, apologetic. I know I made mistakes. I know I hurt you. But I'm asking for a chance to make things right. Not for Nathaniel, but for myself. I need help, Clara. Please. The response had come back 2 days later, short and final. Clara said no. She said you made your choice, and now you live with it. Don't contact her again. Vanessa had stared at the message, her hands shaking, her chest tight with rage and desperation. She'd done everything right. She'd been patient, strategic, careful. She'd waited years for this, and it had all been for nothing. Clara, the woman she'd dismissed as weak and pathetic, had won. And Vanessa, who'd always believed she was smarter, better, more deserving, was left with nothing but the wreckage of her own choices. The final blow came in the form of a meeting Vanessa had managed to secure through sheer persistence. A venture capital firm that had once considered partnering with Nathaniel agreed to see her, and Vanessa had walked into that office with her best smile, her most polished pitch, determined to prove she could still be valuable. The meeting had gone well at first. The partners had listened, asked questions, and seemed interested. And then one of them, a woman named Julia with sharp eyes and a sharper tone, had leaned forward. Before we move forward, I need to ask you something. Is it true you were involved with Nathaniel Whitmore while he was married? Vanessa's stomach had dropped. That's personal. It has nothing to do with business. Julia had smiled cold and knowing. Actually, it has everything to do with business. We do our research, Vanessa. We know who you are. We know what you did. And we know that Clara Whitmore now controls a significant portion of the market we operate in. Partnering with you would be a liability. So, I'm going to be blunt. We're not interested. Vanessa had tried to salvage it, tried to argue, but Julia had stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. Good luck, Vanessa. You're going to need it. Vanessa had left that office, feeling like the ground had been ripped out from under her. She'd walked back to her apartment in a daze, her mind racing, her chest tight with panic. She'd built her entire life on being desired, being valuable, being the woman men wanted and women envied. And now she was nothing. Worse than nothing. She was a cautionary tale, a woman who'd gambled everything on a man who had nothing left to give. That night, alone in her apartment, Vanessa had broken down. She'd screamed, thrown things, sobbed until her throat was raw. She'd called Nathaniel, desperate for someone to blame, someone to share the burden with. But he hadn't answered. She'd called again, and again, and again, until finally, on the 7th call, he picked up. What, Vanessa? His voice was flat, exhausted. Vanessa's voice came out shrill, desperate. You ruined me. You promised me a life, and now I have nothing. This is your fault. Nathaniel had laughed, bitter and hollow. My fault? You chose this, Vanessa. You chose to be with a married man. You chose to smile while his wife fell apart. You chose to believe we'd win. We didn't. And now we both have to live with it. Vanessa had tried to respond, but the line went dead. He'd hung up on her. She'd stared at her phone, her hands shaking, her mind spinning with rage and despair. She'd lost everything. Her reputation, her income, her future. And the worst part, the part that made her want to scream until her lungs gave out, was that Clara had done it without lifting a finger. Clara hadn't fought her, hadn't confronted her, hadn't even acknowledged her existence beyond that one final rejection. Clara had simply existed, had simply thrived, and that alone had been enough to destroy Vanessa completely. Because the world didn't care about mistresses who backed the wrong man. The world didn't have sympathy for women who smiled at deathbeds. The world had moved on, and Vanessa was left behind, invisible, irrelevant, forgotten. Weeks passed, and Vanessa's life continued its downward spiral. She moved to a cheaper apartment, then to a room in a shared house with strangers who didn't know her name and didn't care to learn it. She took a job at a retail store, standing behind a counter for minimum wage, serving customers who treated her like she was beneath them. And maybe she was. Maybe this was where she'd always belonged, and the years with Nathaniel had just been a temporary illusion, a fantasy she'd convinced herself was real. She'd see Clara's name in the news sometimes, articles about hospital reforms, about charitable donations, about a woman who'd turned tragedy into purpose. And every time, Vanessa felt a twist of envy so sharp it made her physically ill. That should have been her life. That should have been her standing in boardrooms, making decisions, commanding respect. But it wasn't. It never would be. Because Vanessa had made a choice, and that choice had destroyed her. One evening, standing in her tiny room with a stack of bills she couldn't pay and a phone that hadn't rung in weeks, Vanessa had a moment of clarity. She'd spent years believing she was smarter than Clara, more deserving, more capable. But the truth was, Clara had always been stronger. Clara had survived a marriage that would have broken most people. She'd survived grief, betrayal, and isolation, and she'd come out the other side with dignity intact. Vanessa, on the other hand, had spent years tearing someone down, believing it would lift her up. And now, she was paying the price. Not because Clara had punished her, but because the universe had a way of balancing the scales. Vanessa sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the blank walls of her room, and for the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to lose. Not just money or status, but purpose, identity, hope. She'd gambled everything on a man who had nothing, and now she had nothing too. And there was no one to blame but herself. Could you forgive someone like Vanessa? Or would you let her face the consequences alone? Vivian had spent her entire life building walls around herself. Walls made of status, wealth, and the carefully cultivated image of a woman who was untouchable. She'd married into old money, raised a son who carried the family name with pride, and positioned herself at the center of every social circle that mattered. Charity galas, country club luncheons, board meetings for foundations that did more networking than actual charity work. Vivian had mastered them all. She'd learned early that power wasn't just about having money. It was about making sure everyone knew you had it, about controlling who got access and who got shut out. And for decades, that strategy had worked. People respected her, feared her. I wanted her approval. But now, sitting alone in a 2-bedroom apartment that smelled like cheap cleaning products and old carpet, Vivian understood that the walls she'd built hadn't protected her. They'd isolated her. And when those walls came down, there was nothing left underneath. The humiliation had started in public, which made it so much worse. Vivian had been attending the annual Winter Gala for the Riverside Foundation, an event she'd helped organize for over 20 years. She'd walked in wearing a dress she'd bought on credit, her head held high, determined to act like nothing had changed. But the moment she stepped into the ballroom, she'd felt it. The shift. The way conversations paused when she approached. The way eyes flickered away when she tried to make contact. The way people who used to greet her warmly now gave polite nods and moved on. She'd found her usual table, the one reserved for major donors, only to discover her name wasn't on the seating chart. A young woman with a clipboard and an apologetic smile had approached her. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm so sorry, but there's been a change. Your table assignment was moved. You're over there." She'd pointed to a table near the back, far from the stage, far from the spotlight, surrounded by people Vivian didn't recognize. Vivian's face had burned with embarrassment. There must be a mistake. I've sat at the main table for 20 years. The woman had glanced down at her clipboard, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Whitmore. The seating was arranged by donation level. Your contribution this year didn't meet the threshold for the main table." Vivian had wanted to argue, to demand to speak to someone in charge, but she'd seen the truth in the woman's eyes. This wasn't a mistake. This was intentional. The foundation knew about her situation, knew about Nathaniel's bankruptcy, knew that the Whitmore name no longer carried the weight it once did. And they'd moved her to the back like she was just another guest, someone who didn't matter. Vivian had walked to her assigned table, her head still high, but her stomach churning with humiliation. She'd sat through the entire evening in silence, watching from a distance, as the people she'd once considered peers laughed and toasted and celebrated without her. No one came to greet her. No one asked how she was doing. She'd become invisible. The social collapse accelerated after that. Invitations that used to arrive weekly stopped coming. The country club, where Vivian had spent decades building relationships and hosting events, quietly revoked her membership. The letter had been polite, citing updated membership criteria and financial restructuring. But Vivian knew the truth. They didn't want her anymore. She wasn't valuable. She was an embarrassment, a reminder that even the most carefully constructed status could collapse overnight. She tried calling friends, women she'd known for 30 years, women she'd helped when there. Marriages fell apart or their children got into trouble. But the calls went unanswered. When she finally reached one of them, a woman named Margaret who'd been her closest confidant, the conversation had been brief and brutal. "Vivian, I can't be seen with you right now. You understand, don't you? People are talking. They're saying awful things about what you did to that poor girl, to Clara. I have grandchildren to think about. I can't be associated with that kind of story." Vivian had tried to defend herself. "I didn't do anything wrong. I was protecting my son. I was protecting our family." Margaret's voice had been cold. "You abandoned a dying woman in a hospital and told her pregnant daughter she was worthless. That's not protecting your family, Vivian. That's cruelty. And now everyone knows it." The phone had gone dead, and Vivian had sat in her apartment, staring at the walls, feeling the weight of her choices crushing down on her. She'd spent years believing that loyalty to family, to status, to the life she'd built was the right thing. But now, facing the consequences, she realized she'd been wrong. She hadn't been protecting Nathaniel. She'd been protecting her own image, her own sense of superiority. And Clara, the daughter-in-law she'd dismissed as weak and insignificant, had been the only one with real strength all along. The worst part wasn't the loss of money or status. It was the realization that she'd traded her humanity for it. She'd looked at a dying woman and decided she wasn't worth helping. She'd looked at a pregnant, grieving daughter-in-law and decided she was better off destroyed. And now, karma has delivered its verdict. Vivian tried to salvage what little she had left. She applied for positions on smaller charity boards, hoping her experience would count for something. But every application was met with polite rejections. She reached out to former colleagues, offering to volunteer, to help with events, to do anything that would give her a sense of purpose again. But no one wanted her. The Whitmore name, once a badge of honor, was now a stain. She'd walk through the city sometimes, passing the buildings she used to enter without a second thought, the restaurants where she used to dine, the shops where she used to spend without checking prices. And she'd feel the weight of her fall, the distance between who she'd been and who she was now. One afternoon, she'd run into an old acquaintance outside a coffee shop. The woman had looked startled, then uncomfortable. "Vivian, I didn't expect to see you here." Vivian had forced a smile. "I live nearby now." The woman nodded, her eyes flickering with something that looked like pity. "I heard about what happened. I'm sorry." But she didn't sound sorry. She'd sounded relieved, like she was grateful it wasn't her standing there, stripped of everything she'd once had. Vivian had started having nightmares, vivid dreams where she was back in that hospital room, watching Eleanor die, watching Clara cry. And in the dream, she'd try to apologize, try to take it back. But Clara would just look at her with empty eyes and say, "It's too late, Vivian. You made your choice." She'd wake up in a cold sweat, her heart racing, her chest tight with guilt she couldn't shake. She'd never thought of herself as a cruel person. She'd convinced herself that everything she'd done had been justified, necessary, the cost of maintaining order and status. But now, alone with nothing but her thoughts, she couldn't escape the truth. She'd been cruel. She'd been heartless. And the woman she tried to destroy had risen while Vivian had fallen. The breaking point came at a small community event Vivian attended, hoping to rebuild some semblance of a social life. She'd been standing near the refreshment table when she'd overheard two women talking. "Did you hear about Clara Whitmore? She just funded a new wing at Riverside Hospital. Named it after her mother." The other woman had responded, her voice full of admiration. "She's incredible. After everything she went through, losing her mom, that awful divorce. And she's out here changing lives. That's real strength." The first woman nodded. "And her mother-in-law, what's her name, Vivian? She's living in some tiny apartment now. Completely broke. Karma's real, isn't it?" Vivian had stood there, frozen, listening to them talk about her like she was a cautionary tale, a villain in someone else's story. And the worst part was, they were right. She was the villain. She'd earned every bit of scorn, every bit of judgment. And there was nothing she could do to change it. She'd left the event early, walked home in the rain, and collapsed on her couch, sobbing for the first time in years. Not because she'd lost her money or her status, but because she'd lost herself. She'd spent so long being the woman everyone feared and respected that she'd forgotten how to be human. And now, facing the emptiness of her life, she realized she didn't even know who she was anymore. Nathaniel had stopped calling months ago, too wrapped up in his own collapse to worry about hers. Vanessa was gone, disappeared into whatever hole she'd crawled into. Vivian was alone, truly alone, with nothing but regret and the echoes of her own cruelty ringing in her ears. She thought about Clara sometimes, wondered if she ever thought about her, if she ever felt satisfaction knowing how far Vivian had fallen. But Clara didn't need to think about her. Clara had moved on, built a life filled with purpose and love, while Vivian was stuck in the past, replaying every mistake, every cruel word. Every moment she could have chosen kindness, but chose superiority instead. One evening, Vivian sat at her small kitchen table, staring at a photo she'd kept from years ago. It was a family picture, Nathaniel and Clara on their wedding day, both of them smiling. Vivian stood beside them, her expression proud, satisfied. She remembered that day, remembered thinking she'd chosen the perfect wife for her son, someone quiet, obedient, easy to control. And she'd been right about Clara being those things. But what Vivian hadn't seen, what she'd been too arrogant to recognize, was the strength underneath. Resilience. The quiet power that didn't need to shout to be heard. Clara had survived everything Vivian had thrown at her, and she'd done it with grace. And now, looking at that photo, Vivian felt something she'd never felt before. Shame. Deep, aching shame that sat in her chest like a stone. She destroyed a woman who deserved better, and the universe had made sure she paid for it. Vivian set the photo down and stared out the window at the city she no longer belonged to. She thought about writing Clara a letter, apologizing, begging for forgiveness. But what would be the point? Words couldn't undo what she'd done. And Clara didn't owe her forgiveness. Clara owed her nothing. So Vivian sat in her apartment, alone with her regrets, knowing that this was her life now. No redemption. No second chances. Just the slow, painful realization that she traded everything that mattered for things that didn't. And there was no coming back from that. If you were Clara, would you ever forgive Vivian, or would you let her live with the weight of what she'd done? Nathaniel had always believed he was untouchable. Not because he was particularly smart or talented, but because he'd been born into the right family, gone to the right schools, and married the right kind of woman who wouldn't cause problems. He'd built his entire life on a foundation of privilege and assumptions, never questioning whether the ground beneath him was solid. And now, standing in a courtroom for what felt like the 100th time, watching his lawyer shuffle papers with the defeated expression of someone who knew they'd already lost, Nathaniel understood that the ground had never been solid at all. It had been Clara holding everything together, and the moment he'd pushed her away, everything had collapsed. The custody hearing was his last attempt, his final desperate play to reclaim some control over a life that had spiraled completely out of his reach. He'd filed motions claiming Clara was using her wealth to manipulate the courts, that she was denying him access to his daughter, that he deserved joint custody at minimum. His lawyer had warned him it was a bad idea, that the evidence against him was overwhelming, but Nathaniel had insisted. He couldn't let Clara win completely. He couldn't accept that the woman he'd once controlled now controlled everything. The judge entered, an older woman with gray hair and a no-nonsense expression that made Nathaniel's stomach turn. She'd presided over several of their hearings, and each time, her patience with him had worn thinner. She sat down, adjusted her glasses, and looked directly at Nathaniel. Mr. Whitmore, I've reviewed your latest motion. Do you have anything new to present, or are we rehashing the same arguments we've already addressed? Nathaniel stood, his voice tight. Your Honor, I'm asking for what any father deserves. Time with my daughter. A chance to be part of her life. Clara has used her financial resources to freeze me out, to paint me as a villain when all I want is to be a parent. The judge's expression didn't change. Mr. Whitmore, we've been over this. You served divorce papers to your wife while she was grieving her mother's death in a hospital room. You abandoned her while she was pregnant. You fought for custody not because you wanted to be a parent, but because you wanted control. The court has seen the evidence. We've heard the testimonies. And every time you come back here, you're wasting this court's time and your daughter's future. Nathaniel's face flushed. That's not fair. I made mistakes, yes, but I'm trying to make things right. I deserve a second chance. The judge leaned forward, her voice sharp. Second chances are earned, Mr. Whitmore, not demanded. And based on your behavior, you haven't earned anything. She turned to Clara, who sat quietly on the other side of the courtroom, her hands folded in her lap, her expression calm. Mrs. Whitmore, do you have anything you'd like to add? Clara stood slowly, her voice steady but firm. Your Honor, Nathaniel didn't want to be a father when I was pregnant. He didn't want to be a father when I begged him to wait until after my mother's funeral to finalize the divorce. He wanted control. He wanted to punish me for existing. And now that I have resources, now that I have the ability to protect my daughter, he wants to pretend he cares. But he doesn't care about her. He cares about winning. And I won't let him use my daughter as a pawn in whatever game he's playing. The judge nodded. I agree. Mr. Whitmore, your petition for joint custody is denied. Your visitation rights remain supervised and limited. If you continue to file frivolous motions, I will hold you in contempt. This hearing is adjourned. Nathaniel stood frozen as the judge left, his lawyer packing up files without looking at him. Clara walked past him toward the exit, and Nathaniel couldn't stop himself. Clara, wait. She stopped but didn't turn around. Nathaniel's voice cracked. Please, just talk to me. 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking. Clara turned slowly, her eyes meeting him for the first time in months. There was no anger there, no hatred, just a cold, detached calm that made Nathaniel feel like he was looking at a stranger. What do you want, Nathaniel? He stepped closer, lowering his voice. I want to fix this. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But we have a daughter together. She deserves to have both parents in her life. Clara's expression didn't change. She has a parent. She has me. And she's safe, loved, and protected. That's more than you ever gave her. Nathaniel's desperation broke through. I was under pressure. My mother was in my ear constantly. Vanessa was. Clara cut him off, her voice sharp. Don't blame them. You made your choices. You signed those papers. You walked out of that hospital room. You fought to take my daughter from me. Those were your decisions, Nathaniel. Own them. Nathaniel felt his chest tighten, panic rising. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Clara. I was wrong about everything. About you, about your mother, about what mattered. I see that now. Please, just give me a chance to prove I've changed. Clara stared at him for a long moment, and Nathaniel thought maybe, just maybe, she'd soften. But when she spoke, her voice was ice. You had chances, Nathaniel. You had years of chances. Every time I asked for help, every time I begged you to see me, to care about what I was going through, you chose not to. And now that I don't need you, now that I've built a life without you, you want another chance? No. You don't get to come back into my life just because yours fell apart. She turned and walked away, leaving Nathaniel standing in the empty courtroom, his hands shaking, his mind racing. He'd lost. Completely, utterly, irreversibly lost. And there was nothing he could do to change it. The weeks that followed were a blur of humiliation and defeat. Nathaniel's business, what little remained of it, finally collapsed when his last investor pulled out. The office he'd rented was repossessed. The car he'd been leasing was returned. He moved into a studio apartment in a part of the city he'd never even driven through before, a place with thin walls and neighbors who shouted at all hours. He'd applied for jobs, dozens of them, but every interview ended the same way. Polite interest, until they Googled his name and found the articles, the op-eds, the social media posts calling him a monster. "We'll be in touch," they'd say, and then they never were. Nathaniel had started drinking more, sitting alone in his apartment with cheap whiskey, scrolling through photos of his daughter on Clara's public social media. She was growing so fast, smiling in every picture, clearly happy, clearly loved. And Nathaniel wasn't part of any of it. He was erased, deleted from her life like he'd never existed. One night, drunk and desperate, Nathaniel had shown up at Clara's apartment building. Security had stopped him at the door, professional but firm. "Sir, you're not on the approved visitor list. You need to leave." Nathaniel had tried to argue, tried to explain that he just wanted to see his daughter, just for a minute. But the security guard had called the police, and Nathaniel had been escorted off the property with a warning. If he came back, he'd be arrested. He'd sat in his car afterward, his head against the steering wheel, sobbing like a child. He'd destroyed everything. His marriage, his business, his relationship with his daughter. And for what? For pride? For control? For the approval of a mother who'd abandoned him the moment he stopped being useful? Vivian hadn't spoken to him in months, too wrapped up in her own collapse to care about him. Vanessa was gone, disappeared into whatever life she'd scraped together. Nathaniel was alone, truly alone, with nothing but the consequences of his own choices. He tried reaching out to old friends, people he'd known since college, guys he'd partied with and done business with. But the responses were cold, distant. "Hey man, I heard what happened. That's rough. Let's catch up sometime." But sometimes it never comes. They didn't want to be associated with him. He was a failure, a cautionary tale. The guy who'd had everything and thrown it away. Nathaniel started seeing a therapist, not because he wanted to change, but because he was drowning and didn't know what else to do. The therapist, a patient woman named Dr. Reeves, had listened to his story without judgment, and then she'd said something that had hit him like a punch to the gut. "You're not grieving the loss of your daughter, Nathaniel. You're grieving the loss of control. You're mourning the version of yourself that had power over someone else's life. And until you understand that, you'll never move forward." Nathaniel had wanted to argue, to defend himself, but deep down, he knew she was right. He didn't miss Clara because he loved her. He missed her because she'd made him feel important. He didn't want to be a father because he cared about his daughter. He wanted to be a father because it was one last way to stay connected to Clara's life, to her wealth, to the world he'd lost. The realization had broken something inside him. He'd spent weeks spiraling, barely eating, barely sleeping, just existing in a fog of regret and self-pity. And then one day, he'd seen Clara on the news. She was at a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new community center she'd funded, holding her daughter on her hip, smiling at the cameras. She looked strong, confident, and happy. She looked like someone who'd survived a war and come out victorious. And Nathaniel, watching from his tiny apartment, felt the full weight of what he'd lost. Not just money or status, but the chance to be part of something good, something meaningful. He'd had a woman who loved him, who would have stood by him through anything, and he'd thrown her away like she was nothing. And now she was everything, and he was nothing. Nathaniel turned off the TV and sat in the dark, his chest tight, his eyes burning with tears he was too exhausted to shed. He thought about calling Clara one more time, about begging for forgiveness, about trying one last desperate attempt to reclaim some piece of what he'd lost. But he knew it wouldn't matter. Clara had moved on. She'd built a life without him, a life where he was irrelevant, invisible, forgotten. And maybe that was what he deserved. Maybe this was justice, cold and final, delivered not through courts or contracts, but through the simple, undeniable truth that actions had consequences. He'd chosen cruelty, and cruelty had destroyed him. He'd chosen control, and control had slipped through his fingers. He'd chosen to discard the one person who'd ever truly cared about him. And now he was left with nothing but the echoes of his own mistakes. Nathaniel closed his eyes, leaning back against the couch, and for the first time in his life, he accepted the truth. He'd lost, and he'd never get it back. Would you feel any sympathy for Nathaniel, or would you say he got exactly what he deserved? Clara stood at the window of her new home, watching the sun rise over the city, her daughter asleep in the room down the hall. The house wasn't a mansion, wasn't some sprawling estate meant to show off wealth. It was a home, warm and filled with light, with a backyard where her daughter could play safely, with neighbors who smiled and waved instead of judging. Clara had chosen it carefully, not for its size or status, but because it felt right, because it felt like a place where they could both heal and grow. She sipped her coffee slowly, thinking about how far she'd come, how different her life looked now compared to 2 years ago when she'd been sitting in that hospital room, broken and alone. The woman she'd been then felt like a stranger, someone she barely recognized. That Clara had been scared, powerless, convinced she'd never escape the weight of Nathaniel and Vivian's cruelty. But this Clara, the one standing here now, had learned something her mother had tried to teach her all along. The strength wasn't loud. It wasn't about fighting back with anger or revenge. It was about surviving, rebuilding, and protecting what mattered most. Her daughter had just turned 2, and watching her grow had been the greatest gift Clara could have asked for. Every milestone, every laugh, every moment of pure, unfiltered joy reminded Clara why she'd fought so hard. This little girl would never know hunger. She'd never know fear. She'd never know what it felt like to be powerless or invisible or dismissed. Clara had made sure of that. She'd built a life where her daughter could thrive, where she'd be surrounded by love and safety and the knowledge that she was valued. And that was the legacy Clara wanted to leave, not billions of dollars or business empires, but the simple, unshakable truth that love and resilience could overcome anything. Clara walked to her daughter's room and stood in the doorway, watching her sleep, her tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. She looked peaceful, content, completely unaware of the battles that had been fought to give her this life. And that was how it should be. Children shouldn't have to carry the weight of their parents' struggles. They should just get to be children. Clara had kept her promise to her mother. The hospital where Eleanor had died was now one of the best in the state, with updated equipment, compassionate staff, and programs designed to help people who couldn't afford care. Clara had named the new wing after her mother, a quiet tribute to the woman who'd sacrificed everything to give Clara a chance. She visited sometimes, walking through the halls, talking to patients and staff, making sure the standards she'd set were being maintained. And every time she left, she felt her mother's presence, felt the weight of Eleanor's love and foresight guiding her. "You did this, Mom," Clara would whisper. "You made all of this possible." Because it was true. Without Eleanor's hidden empire, without her careful planning and sacrifice, Clara would still be fighting just to survive. But Eleanor had given her more than money. She'd given her a blueprint for resilience, a map for how to turn pain into purpose. The businesses Clara now controlled had been transformed. She'd brought in leaders who valued ethics over profit, who treated employees like human beings instead of disposable assets. She'd implemented fair wages, healthcare benefits, and policies that protected workers from the kind of exploitation she'd seen too often. It wasn't just about running successful companies. It was about creating environments where people could thrive, where they didn't have to sacrifice their dignity for a paycheck. Clara had also quietly funded scholarships for single mothers, for women escaping abusive relationships, for anyone who reminded her of where she'd been. She didn't do it for recognition or praise. She did it because she knew what it felt like to be powerless, to need help and have nowhere to turn. And if her wealth could change that for even one person, it was worth it. One afternoon, Clara received a call from Margaret, her lawyer who'd fought beside her through the custody battle. Clara, I wanted to let you know something. Nathaniel tried filing another motion last week. Claimed you were alienating his daughter from him. Clara's stomach tightened, but her voice stayed calm. What happened? Margaret's tone was matter-of-fact. The judge threw it out. Didn't even schedule a hearing. She told his lawyer that if Nathaniel files one more frivolous motion, she'll hold him in contempt and impose fines. He's done, Clara. He has no legal ground left to stand on. Clara closed her eyes, relief washing over her. Thank you, Margaret, for everything. Margaret's voice softened. You did this, Clara. You fought when most people would have given up. Your daughter is lucky to have you. Clara smiled, tears stinging her eyes. I'm the lucky one. That evening, Clara sat with her daughter in the living room, reading her favorite storybook for what felt like the 100th time. Her daughter giggled at the pictures, pointing at the animals and making sounds that were almost words. Clara kissed her forehead and held her close, whispering the same promise she'd made in the hospital. You're safe. You're loved. And you're going to grow up knowing you can do anything. Her daughter looked up at her with wide, trusting eyes, and Clara felt her heart swell. This was what mattered. Not the courtroom victories, not the business deals, not the revenge that had unfolded naturally as Nathaniel, Vivian, and Vanessa faced the consequences of their own choices. What mattered was this moment, this connection, this knowledge that Clara had broken the cycle of cruelty and built something better. Clara had started writing letters to her daughter. Letters she'd give her one day when she was older, when she could understand. In them, Clara wrote about Eleanor, about the strength and sacrifice of the grandmother she'd never meet. She wrote about the hospital room, the divorce, the custody battle, not to burden her daughter with pain, but to teach her that survival was possible, that even when the world felt impossible, there was always a way forward. Your grandmother taught me that strength isn't about never falling, Clara wrote. It's about getting back up every single time. It's about protecting the people you love, even when it costs you everything. And it's about building something better, not for yourself, but for the people who come after you. Clara sealed the letters in envelopes, tucking them away in a box she'd give her daughter on her 18th birthday. By then, her daughter would be strong enough to carry the weight of the story, to understand the battles that had been fought for her. Months passed, and Clara continued building the life she'd envisioned. She attended board meetings, made decisions about investments and expansions, but she always made time for her daughter. She'd learned that balance wasn't about doing everything perfectly. It was about knowing what mattered most and protecting it fiercely. She didn't work late nights or sacrifice time with her daughter for business deals. She'd hired people she trusted to handle the day-to-day operations, people who shared her values and vision. And when she was home, she was fully present, playing on the floor, reading stories, teaching her daughter to be kind, strong, and unafraid. One evening, Clara received an unexpected email. It was from Vivian. The subject line read, "I'm sorry." Clara stared at it for a long time, her finger hovering over the delete button. But something made her open it. The message was short. Clara, I know I have no right to contact you. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know that I'm sorry. I was wrong about everything. About you, about your mother, about what mattered. I destroyed my own life trying to control yours, and I'll live with that regret until the day I die. I don't expect you to respond. I just needed you to know. Clara read it twice, then closed the email without replying. She didn't owe Vivian forgiveness. She didn't owe her closure. Vivian would have to live with her choices, just like everyone else. But later that night, as Clara tucked her daughter into bed, she realized something. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't bitter. The rage that had fueled her through the darkest days had faded, replaced by something steadier, something stronger. Peace. She'd won, not because she'd destroyed her enemies, but because she'd built a life they could never touch. Nathaniel was irrelevant. Vivian was powerless. Vanessa was forgotten. And Clara was free. Free to live, to love, to raise her daughter without fear or shame or the weight of anyone else's cruelty. She kissed her daughter goodnight and walked back to the living room, sitting in the quiet, feeling the fullness of everything she'd built. Her mother's legacy lived on, not just in the businesses or the hospital or the wealth, but in Clara herself, in her strength, in her resilience, in her refusal to let cruelty define her. Clara picked up her phone and looked at a photo she'd saved, one of the last pictures of her mother before she'd gotten sick. Eleanor was smiling, her eyes bright and full of life, her hand resting on Clara's shoulder. Clara traced her mother's face with her finger, her voice a whisper. "I did it, Mom. I survived. I protected her. I built something good, just like you taught me." And in the silence of her home, Clara felt her mother's presence, felt the warmth of her love wrapping around her like a blanket. Eleanor had known this day would come. She'd planned for it, prepared for it, sacrificed for it. And now, Clara was living the life her mother had fought to give her. A life of safety, dignity, and unshakable strength. The people who tried to destroy her were gone, faded into irrelevance, paying for their cruelty in ways Clara had never needed to orchestrate. The universe had balanced the scales. And Clara, standing in the life she'd rebuilt from nothing, understood the most important lesson her mother had ever taught her. The greatest inheritance wasn't money. It wasn't power. It wasn't revenge. It was the strength to survive, the courage to rebuild, and the love to protect what mattered most. And Clara had all three. She closed her eyes, a smile spreading across her face, and whispered one final promise. "We're going to be okay, baby. We're going to be more than okay. Because we survived. And that's all that matters." Would you have been strong enough to walk Clara's path? Could you have forgiven, or would you have held on to the anger? What would you have done differently? Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the story, hit the subscribe button and drop a comment telling us the part of the story you enjoyed most.